You're the expert here. Do you want to tell us?
Right, so exam techniques. I'm going to talk about 3 exam techniques. Exam techniques are critical for a dyslexic. The reason being is because exam techniques teach us little memorable things that we can apply in exams and also apply when we're practicing for exams. There's a huge cost not to knowing exam techniques, for example, not knowing how to structure a paragraph, because whilst the person writing that exam doesn't know it at the time, but they're losing out on huge marks. What I recommend is, that's another thing to add on to what Stephen was saying, the tutor must teach exam technique. I want to talk about 3 exam techniques that I think lots of people at different levels should be learning. But my general tip here is learn as many different exam techniques as possible. Again, in our ebook, and our tutors will have lots of exam technique. So the first exam technique, what we have is something called allocate. Now, it doesn't matter whether you are 11 years old and doing an exam, or if you're doing an exam for your masters at university, your questions will have a number of marks. So say you're given an essay question with 25 marks. There will be, and I'm sure lots of you haven't seen it, a mark scheme for this, and there will be past mark schemes for this, which allocate different marks to different things. For example, in A-level economics, you were given a mark scheme, you give it a 25 mark essay question, and 5 marks would be for basic knowledge, 10 marks would be for application of this knowledge, and then 10 marks for evaluation. What you need to do is you need to work out how to allocate marks in different questions. So, for example, GCSE student looking at a 6-mark question, they'll say, okay, it's 2 marks for defining that question, 2 marks for applying the knowledge, and 2 marks for explaining the diagram, or something like that. It will differ depending on your level and your subject. It will always differ, but the process is always the same, is that you allocate, i.e. you allocate marks before you start to answer the question. So before you even start to say, okay, well, the answer is in 1914, that's when it happened. You say, okay, 1, state what the date is. 2, explain what happened in that date. 3, state an example, and that's my 3 marks there. If you don't allocate, you are at risk of saying what you think the answer is, not what the examiner should be the answer.
And I presume it's the case that the exam itself won't specify where the marks are going to be allocated. That's got to come through practice and exam technique.
Absolutely. So exams don't actually change that much in format. They might change the questions, but the format doesn't change. It's usually the case, unless there's a huge shake-up that year, that you're going to get a 25-mark question if you've had a 25-mark question for the last 4 years. There are changes, and it's important to be ready for those changes. But on the whole, start to learn that format.
Okay, so we're going to move on to point 2 of exam technique, which is paraphrasing now.
Paraphrasing is a quietly powerful tool. I'll explain it to everyone, and everyone will say, "Oh, that's obvious," and it's obvious that that's a good thing to do. People don't apply this, and it's important to state this. People think it's a good idea, but people don't do it. It's like planning. It tends not to happen, especially in exams, unless paraphrasing is a regular part of a student's practice. Paraphrasing very simply means putting it in your own words. So, for example, people listening into this webinar, I say a point, or say Stephen said some very helpful stuff on getting an assessment. Now, the way a dyslexic can successfully learn that is by paraphrasing it, i.e. by saying, okay, so what Stephen said was, there are 2 types of things. There's a test and assessment, etc., etc. That person is saying it in their own words. You need to paraphrase every single question. The reason being is because, and I spoke to a chief examiner who said that 90% of students underperform because of exam technique. And the key reason they were doing it was that they were not reading the question. They were answering the question thinking that they had some sort of understanding of it, and then they would bolt like a horse and start writing, because in an exam the pressure's on, and your first thought is not, okay, let's stop and really absorb this question. Your first thought is, let's just write as much information as possible. And I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying don't do that. Paraphrase a question so you can say it in your own words. Because once you've said it in your own words, at that point you would have perfectly understood the question, and not before. Because if you can say something in your own words, unquestionably your understanding of it is far better than you simply reading and absorbing the information.
And would you say in an exam situation the student should write that down in their own words, or just say it to themselves? What's the preferred method?
Unquestionably, that should be at the beginning of their practice. They should be paraphrasing the question. And sometimes, it depends on the level and the subject, but they should be paraphrasing that question 3 or 4 times and showing that to a tutor. So that's a critical aspect. In the exam, they should probably paraphrase it once, but also write it down.
Write it down as well. Okay, we're going to move on now to the final aspect, which is, interesting enough, called ACTS. Right.
This is an acronym about paragraphs. Other teachers have other acronyms about paragraphs. I like theirs just as much as I like the one that I created. The reason being is because you need some sort of structure to a paragraph. I'm going to quickly go through the structure to this paragraph. However, I think there's one called point, explain, expand, or something like that. There are many. For A levels, if you don't include evaluation, you can only perform half marks, even if your essay was 400 pages long. You would only get half marks because you didn't include evaluative points. What a student needs to know is they need to know the language of the mark scheme. Doesn't matter what level they are, whether they are, I think for someone who's 13 or 14 years old, I think it's more simple, but they still need to understand how mark schemes work. And then GCSE, it's a different skill, it's more analysis. Going up to A level and undergraduate, it's a lot of evaluative stuff. This is an A level example, ACTS in your paragraph, although you can use it also for GCSEs. Every paragraph you make, the first sentence you state the argument, and that involves no explanation at all. The second sentence you explain the argument, so that is explaining the logistics of it, and the third part is evaluating. Again, we're going to go into a lot more detail in the ebook, so if you're interested in finding out more, have a look at our information online.
So Pat, just to try and make this kind of real and practical for people listening, every single paragraph when you're writing an essay should contain these three components. Is that right?
Yes. This is one way of doing it. It's just a little acronym that you can capture and apply for lots of different written types. It's not going to perfectly fit into every single subject, and it's important that students learn lots of different acronyms, but what I did find is it's a very effective way for a dyslexic to apply information, because lots of the time a dyslexic is so consumed with the content of the information that the order and the structure gets kind of left behind. So if a dyslexic was sticking to this what I would do with a dyslexic, providing it works with the mark scheme, is that they said every single paragraph that you do, I want you to apply AXE, for economics, politics, sociology, psychology, and English literature, etc. The reason being is because then they will have perfectly formed paragraphs every single time. And if you were to combine, for example, allocate and AXE, you say allocate, okay, there's my 25 mark answer, there's an intro, 4 paragraphs, and then a conclusion. In each of the 4 paragraphs, apply AXE and 2 evaluative points. And without even knowing what the subject is, I've just created an essay structure. And that's all essay structure is. It's just working out the order of information and the type of information. So as you can see, like stating the argument is a very different type of information to evaluating the information. What I am aware is, that there's a lot of people from different levels and different countries listening to this. So it's going to differ it's going to vary depending on the student. But I am saying, if you do learn one message from this last part, it is, learn exam technique, learn acronyms about how to structure paragraphs and essays.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. We're now going to move on to the Q&A part of the webinar.